Well, what I think is not clear in McGilchrist is precisely when the left brain mode is supposed to interrupt or override the right brain modality as part of its historically specialized function. Oh, hi. I'm Layman Pascal, and this is part two of an eternal discussion with Ēlen Awalom on the integral stage in a retro liminal cafe somewhere on the west side of the metamodern scene. Hi there.
Howdy.
Hmm. Um, People have seen you on this before, so they know you a little bit. What has been on your mind or of most concern to you lately around developmental and attachment issues and trauma when it comes to the way you see gender played out in society at the moment?
Yeah, so um, honestly, I think this has been bubbling up, this crisis amongst the genders, particularly in the West, but really it's a global phenomenon because we have things like passport bros, which I can come back to later, which are essentially men from the Western world who may or may not have economic privilege in the West, but travel elsewhere, usually to developing countries in Southeast Asia and Latin America and Africa and Eastern Europe, because they want women who are quote unquote feminine, authentically feminine. So that's been something that has been a pattern in the West for decades, but has really, really taken off and has much more of an audience as social media has come to occupy more and more of our psychological space. So yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about it for quite some time. And I even remember as a small child, when I was growing up, there would often be people in my community, my family's from Eritrea, who would, like men, specifically men. It was very rare for a woman to do so, but men who would go back to find women who were untainted in Eritrea versus the westernized Eritrean women. And that was not a new pattern because even during the movement for liberation, uh, often the women who were veterans, the female freedom fighter veterans, complained that in the aftermath, post liberation, nobody wanted them as partners. You know, they were considered too opinionated, too domineering, too undesirable, you know, as women who had become, you know, feminists and communists and had really become intellectuals, whether they had been formally or informally educated. So it's not a new phenomenon. This idea that um, I'm going to speak now from the perspective of someone critiquing people who identify as men, because I think there are really important and valid critiques on both sides. But in my experience, typically the men who are on the Andrew Tate, red pill, black pill, incel, passport bro, men going their own way, all of these various movements that have emerged and become really powerful, actually, powerful forces over the last few decades. Typically, they are men who have experienced early trauma, whether it was, you know, from their male caregiver or their female caregiver, and then they had all kinds of coping mechanisms and survival strategies that they adopted so that they could move through the world and navigate. And oftentimes they kind of went into young adulthood and adulthood kind of stumbling and fumbling their way through trying to figure out, how do I talk to girls? How do I get bigger muscles? The girls seem to like that. How do I you know, okay, maybe I shouldn't wear like Old Spice. I guess that's like something that my grandpa or my dad wore, but like what kind of cologne is cool? So all these different things that I think in previous generations there were rites of passage, whether these were indigenous populations, African populations, or even European populations, right? Young men went through rites of passage, initiations, as they moved from being children to young men and then to adult men. And that has disappeared. And in the absence of those rituals, um, has in the absence of those rituals, we have seen the explosion of men, some who I think are very well-meaning, and then some who are not so well-meaning, who are capitalizing off of the trauma. But regardless, typically men who are speaking from a very, very traumatized place, who have not usually scratched the surface of their trauma. I recently watched an interview that Andrew Tate did with a former actor. I think he's Canadian, actually. A former actor turned psychologist. And this psychologist that I really admire, named Dr. Honda, he has a YouTube channel, was doing an analysis of it. And he reminds us, he says, I'm not his clinician. I'm just watching excerpts. I can't diagnose him. But based on what I'm observing, I see a man who is extremely wounded, extremely emotionally and psychologically shut down, very afraid, very incapable of exhibiting any kind of vulnerability, and calling that masculinity, right? Calling that level of performative stoicism masculinity. And honestly, I have a lot of grief. Like, even as we're talking about this, I'm feeling waves and waves of grief. But I also notice that there are hints of optimism, because simultaneous to this process of indoctrination, more young men than ever before are entering different spaces of healing, whether those are men's groups, whether those are, retreats, or, mental health practitioners, whatever, Alcoholics Anonymous, Al-Anon, there's so many different communities that can support people as they're developing. But I'm aware that there is a heavy emphasis on the gender wars and how there's so much antipathy and animosity between particularly heterosexual men and women. But at the same time, I also know, based on the data and based on my experiences, that things are also shifting, right? That men are learning that it's healthy and safe to feel their emotions, to feel their bodies, to feel themselves. So that's one piece of it. And so essentially my thesis is that on both sides of the gender wars, we have oftentimes the most traumatized of those populations speaking as representatives, and assuming the absolute worst of the opposite gender, and then providing advice based upon those fallacies, based upon those cognitive distortions.
In a developmental view, it seems to me there's always this interesting dialectic between like primitivism and pathology, between natural simple levels and the kinds of stresses that cause us to either not develop or even regress to certain levels. And if we imagine that we want people not just to be at the best possible level they can be at, but that we want representatives and spokespeople and teachers at every one of those levels, it may be the case that when people are going to stay at one of those lower levels, like a kind of a barbaric sentiment, they're only going to do that because they're traumatized in some way, that they've sacrificed some of their developmental potential to be a kind of station holder at that level. So how do we make use of people at level specific capacities when very often they're going to be in sort of inherently traumatized people if that's where they're operating?
Could you elaborate on what you mean by make use?
Well, I mean, like if I look at, so you've mentioned Andrew Tate, who I find distasteful just on a human level, but he's speaking developmentally to a certain band, a certain set of instincts, a certain kind of worldview and value system. Now, we might look at that and say, well, I don't find that healthy, and that's not the one I want to be at. That's not where I want my kids learning information. I would like them to be here. But I understand we can't all be here, and it might not even be good to have all the communication be at the higher levels. Where do people get training and energy and experience at those lower levels, if not for people who we might look at and go, well, that's insufficient, but maybe it has to be insufficient in order to hold space for people to have experiences at those simpler levels.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I feel I touched on that a little bit in our conversation thus far, and also in I think it was the integral stage or another integral Facebook group where a link was posted to Homat's interview on your YouTube. But essentially, I think that there are men in those communities. So, for instance, my community of origin, right, where a lot of people function at stage red, right? And there are reasons for that that I kind of touched upon, including very serious war trauma spanning over a century. That doesn't mean they've constantly been at war, to be clear, because someone criticized me for that, but not true state of peace for over a century. So, in those societies, there were all kinds of ways that men taught young men how to embody masculinity, right? So there were still ideas about protecting women, about taking care of your children. You were definitely not to abandon your children under any circumstances. There was usually an allegiance to a particular religious group, whether it was a church or a mosque or a temple or what have you, right? So usually there were all kinds of pillars in the community that kind of enveloped young men in love and in leadership. So I think encouraging, and I do believe that there is a resurgence happening. I was watching, I think it was yesterday, Russell Brand has converted to Christianity. I'm not sure. I believe he's Catholic as well now, along with like Candace Owens and a few other, major public figures. So I think there is, regardless of the level that people are operating at, I think there is a longing for the important foundation that many of us experience within the context of organized religion. So I do think that's one main place, but the other is, I think, so essentially, I think that I was adding on that podcast, YouTube's, other forums where there are men who are speaking from what we might consider a more embodied space, even if they are speaking from an earlier stage. I think particularly for women, to help promote those spaces, right? Instead of constantly being in reaction to all the things that we don't like and we don't enjoy, for women and society in general, to really give much more energy and attention to what we want to see more of. That's a big part of it. I know, I think it's part of the unhealthy pathology of postmodernism is to focus heavily on critique and all that is wrong in the world. And unfortunately, I think this crisis, these gender wars that we're seeing, are a product of that. Because not only are people, young men and women, flocking to these channels, but then there are all kinds of additional free press given. So there are response videos and there are people amplifying it, when I think a healthier way forward would be to say, okay, a lot is really broken, but actually there are many people speaking from a healthier place, even if they are perhaps very traditional and conservative and blue or red. There are healthy manifestations of these stages. And what would it look like to promote those voices instead?
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think the difference between healthy and unhealthy, and I want to say like narrow and more complete versions of these stages, is often uninspected. So we can get there is a sense in which we think, okay, well, a lot of the young men, not all of them, but a lot of them need, aggression and, hunting and fighting and training, like that's a part of that. But it's not just a gang or some sort of quasi-sociopathic agency, because in the actual historical circumstances in which the red level evolves, there's men and women and different functions and elders and kids and an entire life world, right? So when we see it taken out of its actual living context, we get a broken version of it. So it would be nice to see thoughtful attempts to regenerate healthier, more complete versions of these stages and to make them more directly available to people using our new tools. But one of the things that's interesting about that is it has to be communicated in a way that will get attention in the current technological format. So, home math is imperfect, but the critique that some people might have is like, well, why use a name like that? Isn't that already setting out on the wrong foot? But would he even have any eyeballs or followers if it wasn't provocative? And how do you think we need to, how does health communicate itself in the current digital environment where certain things are favored in that environment that are, that you have to be provocative and transgressive and simplified in many ways in order just to get a message through to people?
Well, one of the podcasters that I was watching earlier, he's African American. I believe his name is Stefan, Stephan, Speaks, and he is absolutely a Christian. He's originally, actually, sorry, he's not African American. He's Caribbean American, and he was talking about his the success of his platform, despite being one that, in my opinion and in many others' opinions, is a voice about romantic relationships that is much healthier than what is in the general mainstream. But his capacity to be successful is because instead of moving from his fear of not being successful, of not earning enough income, of not getting enough views, he really was able to tap into divine wisdom and to follow that guidance every step of the way. So I think it is possible to provide a nuanced perspective that is coming from a space of love for people of all genders, and is preaching doctrines that incite feelings of harmony and unity, whilst being very successful. I don't think it's one or the other. But that is an important question, because I think that's part of the conundrum of the world that we live in. And usually that leads people to a critique of capitalism. They say, oh, like this economic system that we're in makes it so that people have to do XYZ in order to thrive. But I would say yes, and. I would say yes, and the deeper truth, in my opinion, is that we are disembodied, that we are disconnected from the divine. And we can't hear those whispers. We can't hear that wisdom, those instructions about go here, talk to that person, write an email to that person, drink this, all of that information. And so, in my opinion, it's actually, that's the deeper truth beneath the trauma that we are perpetuating against one another.
Do you think the wisdom of that divine whisper always goes along with emotional health, or are there situations where they are independent, where you might have someone able to access this kind of wisdom but be emotionally unhealthy, or be emotionally healthy and not able to access that wisdom?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I've spoken before about being in my 20s and having this earth-shattering experience of awakening, but being very unintegrated. And I walked around speaking like Jesus for years at a time. Like, it was very very intense. And there were many words of beautiful wisdom that flowed out of me. Um, and I made amazing art. I even exhibited at like, prestigious art galleries and all of that. But I was emotionally and psychologically, there was a lot of fragmentation and there was a lot of integration that was really yearning to occur. So I definitely think it's possible, but I think it's a partial wisdom. It's not like an embodied wisdom, and it can be harmful to the person experiencing it and to the others in their vicinity. And then, likewise, oftentimes some of the people who are actually truly securely attached in this world and very emotionally and psychologically healthy don't have any interest or even any access to those realms, right?
I'm going to try something. Have you ever seen anyone pet darkness?
No, that is absolutely a first for me, Layman. Yeah.
Okay, so we've been exploring a need born in an insufficiency of really healthy developmental gender expressions and gender role models. Now, that's a subset of the general emotional condition of the civilization that we're in,
Mhm.
which has not been great for a while, partly because we live in artificial conditions that our ancestors didn't live in, partly because, I mean, even if you're in a really nice country, your grandparents were in a war. So we're all inheriting a lot of trauma from a variety of sources. But you have a sense that in the post-COVID era, there's been an amplification of the emotional dysregulation of our relational life.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, in the last 3 years, a number of very popular Facebook groups catering to women who are active on dating sites have emerged. And now, I mean, there are millions of women on these platforms, and they exist in most, if I don't want to say all, but definitely most large cities. And there are narratives, story upon story upon story. A woman will say, I went on a date with Julian, and and then I discovered when I got home that he's actually married with six children. You're kind of making a laugh. Like, obviously, it can be very like awful to learn something like that. Or she'll say, if something felt a little off, and then Julian's wife will chime in and be like, "We've been married for 20 years. Like, what is going on? Why is he on Tinder?" So part of what's happening is the adoption of these digital tools has led to increased transparency. And so the things that used to lurk in the shadows, right, are coming to the light. So that's part of it. Like during the pandemic, people began using social media and technology even at even greater numbers. And then sites like the ones and groups like the ones that I mentioned emerged. And then that led to even more transparency. So I will say that part of it may be, again, that we're just more aware. People are no longer able to behave in ways that are deceptive or that other people experience as harmful without there being awareness of what's going on, right? Um, so, but the other part of it is that I think many people experienced isolation, frustration, and particularly a lot of men. I think I'm going to speak about millennials and Gen Z. Many of them seem very frustrated and pessimistic about their options, a sense that they may not ever find, let alone finding a partner, they may not even find someone with whom to be intimate on a regular basis. And on the other hand, from a lot of women, both in just my day-to-day life, and then reading these groups, reading the narratives in these groups for, hours upon hours, a lot of them are saying that they actually just don't want to engage. It's not that they can't find people with whom to engage. It's that many of them, particularly millennials, are divorcees. They've already been through it. They have, children, they have responsibilities, they have careers, and they're kind of like, I'd rather use my time and energy elsewhere, because the majority of men that they encounter don't have the emotional skills, emotional intelligence to develop a healthy relationship. So I think that for young men, there are many different options. One of them is to go like the AI route and get an AI girlfriend and, just be like, to heck with human women. Another option is to actually do the work that I mentioned earlier, the emotional developmental work. And they will often find that they have more partners available to them, and more than maybe there's a stereotypical notion of a man named Chad who's like, 6'4" and very muscular and, perhaps of like English ancestry, we'll say, and, just almost like the old school idea of wasps in the 1980s. So he looks like that. And all the ladies want him. All the ladies want to be with him. Maybe he went to Harvard, etc. But I think that part of what incels and these other groups are capitalizing on is that the landscape has actually shifted, but they're telling old stories. Because over and over, you'll see the women say, well, I've dated those guys. And what I actually have learned over and over and over again is that more than anything, I want a man who is mature. Right. And that is what is missing. So, yeah, I think I answered your question.
Do you think the type of women that you're describing are emotionally mature enough to attract the mature men that they think they need?
That's a wonderful question, because what I also started to notice as I was in these forums is that oftentimes there were women who were not yet ready to take accountability and to look at their role. Because if you end up, like, I'll speak for myself, or I'll speak about clients that I've worked with. Usually the more that the client learned how to connect to her own body and her feminine wisdom, the more quickly people who were not a match disappeared from her life, right? So they might just ghost her, they might stop responding to her messages. They will notice this woman means business and I'm here to F around. And they would just completely remove themselves from her reality one way or the other. Or maybe she might go on one date with them and she would recognize this doesn't feel good somatically, and she would move on, right? So I think I agree with you. I don't think you weren't making the point, but I agree with the underlying idea in your question, which is that if you end up in a relationship with someone who is not, who is behaving in a manner that is deceptive or that you consider to be harmful or abusive, it's really important to look at yourself, to look at your boundaries, to examine your connection to your body. And all of this, of course, it's very important to be done very gently and with a profound amount of love and not shame, because I don't believe in shaming the quote unquote abusive men, nor the women who, or vice versa. I want to be very clear, because it's people of all genders engage in this behavior. But I think it's important to do it in a way that is very gentle and loving, but to start to unravel that and to say, hey, in that moment when he mentioned that, he's been single for 6 years, I didn't ask him about that. And I remember I felt a funny feeling I didn't dig deeper because I was maybe I was afraid of seeming confrontational. Maybe I was afraid that he wouldn't like me and ask me out on a second date. Whatever it was, something was happening inside of me that made it such that I didn't feel that I could articulate my discomfort or my curiosity, right? And so I agree that typically the women who already are in a healthier space either are with partners who are also similarly healthy, or they're single. Like they realize, okay, well, I have not yet met that person, but it's much better to be alone than to be with someone who is, someone who is in a mutually activating in an unhealthy manner dynamic.
So we need to set up systems, resources, role models for people that, without shame, embrace people where they are and do something to help accelerate the unfolding of their emotional and relational maturation.
Mhm.
Healing trauma is going to be a big part of that. The unfolding of more nuance and complexity in their cognition is going to be a big part of that. And their ability to um, be with the information and authenticity of their body and figure out ways to express that which are empowering rather than problematic. Um, yeah, no question there. It just seems like those are three important things.
I I I concur, and um, I'll give you an example. I remember um, someone posted that she had been messaging with a guy for a few days, and whenever whenever like 6 p.m. hit, he would say, "All right, I'll message you later," and then he would not reappear again until the next morning. And she said, I have a funny feeling about this. We've only been messaging for a few days, but I think he might have a significant other. I think, I just feel that he's not being honest. I don't know what's up. And then he always acts as though he didn't just ghost me, like that he didn't just say, okay, I'll talk to you later. He doesn't say, oh, I'm sorry, I meant to message you last night. He just completely like brushes over that. And so she posted that, and the majority of the women started defending him and saying, well, I do that too. And you're demanding too much. You don't even know the man. You haven't even met him yet. And so here was this woman having, these intuitive insights. And a lot of the women who responded were very, very defensive. And these were the same women who would complain about men in the groups. And so that's part of, I withdrew about maybe like 10 months ago because I realized, one, that it's very, for my own emotional and mental health, reading all of these stories about men behaving really, really poorly was not conducive to my mental health. And then two, I realized that, oh, well, part of what's going on is that these women, most of them are not yet standing in their sovereignty, or maybe they're at the beginning of that journey. And so I'm just reading basically about traumatized people traumatizing, each other. So anyhow.
Is it possible for the somatic signals coming from our bodily intuition to deceive us? Like, should we always heed them, or might they not be misleading at times?
Yeah, I think part of the work that we did with clients when I worked for a dating coaching company that was geared towards helping women build secure attachment, with the understanding that they may or may not manifest their dream partner at the end of the 3.5 month period, but that regardless, they would be in a much healthier state so that they could thrive in life, and that eventually they would likely find someone who is compatible. But part of the work that we did was somatic work and helping them discern the difference between their fear and their old trauma-based thinking and their actual bodily wisdom. We had all kinds of practices to help them engage in feminine embodiment work. And of course, I cringe a little bit using that word just because now, so this was like 5 years ago, or maybe 5.5 years ago, but now it's all over like Instagram. And, there are women, very, nothing wrong with it, but they're very scantily clad women on the beaches of Tulum who took a 1 weekend course and they're teaching feminine embodiment. So I just wanted to track that. I am having a little bit of a reaction to that, but that is part of what we were teaching them, which is that, hey, part of the reason you've been having these undesirable experiences with men is that likely even if you grew up in a relatively healthy environment in your childhood, you probably didn't receive any kind of initiation or training into womanhood and into what it means to be a partner. So I agree.
Mostly we've been talking about male-female dating dynamics of various kinds, but the crisis of emotional and relational immaturity in our society is much broader than that. It applies to every kind of relationship. So I wonder what sorts of dynamics that are insufficient that you see in female-female friendships.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one. That is a really good one because um, during this post-COVID era, I have also relocated a few times. And first I was in Mexico, and then a little over 2 years ago, I came back home to Washington, D.C. And I've been attempting to make friends. And what I have found over and over again is whether they are somatic psychotherapists or whether they are healers or burners or, communities that I would consider to be adjacent to my interests, that over and over again, the majority of women that have come across my path haven't really, even if they are spiritual, that developmental work hasn't really begun, or it's at it's in its infancy. And this is part of what has actually helped me build compassion for men, for heterosexual men. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is how difficult it is even trying to establish a casual friendship with a woman. I can't imagine what it's like to build a romantic relationship with a woman. But in general, I see women who oftentimes are just very confrontational and really quick to jump to conclusions and make accusations about what is happening in reality without kind of slowing down and checking in. And of course, that can be very detrimental to human relationships. I'm reflecting for a moment because I'm like, it can't all have been like unpleasant. And again, I am speaking as someone who's been a bit of a hermit for years now, as someone who's emerging from that hermit stage. So it's possible that I need to get out more, but I was out quite a bit when I lived in Mexico, and I was living in Tulum and then Playa del Carmen, and there were a lot of people who were into all of the spiritual and Eastern philosophy that I was, but it was really simple things. Like I had a movie night, and we were only allowed to have 15 guests because it was like some arbitrary rule that the hotel had, and it was like an outdoor movie night. And I let someone know, I'm sorry, we're already at capacity, but I can put you on the waiting list. And then I saw her out and about. She said, I don't care. I heard it sucked anyway. Because I was like, I'm so sorry. I really wanted to include you. And this was a woman who was the same age as I am and who was like a Reiki healer and a coach. And, but it was like, that was over and over and over and over again. And I was like, either I was so busy fawning earlier in my trauma recovery, that fawning and people pleasing, that I would just disregard when people were being, behaving in a manner I consider immature, and I would still befriend them. Or people have, even in the friendship arena, people are even more dysregulated post-COVID, because I would have anticipated that someone who does that kind of work for a living would say, "Oh, it's okay. Maybe next time I'll be able to attend, and and we'll have a good time." But instead, it was like this, like, "F you, how dare you reject me," right? So this is why I like that question that you had earlier about that. Essentially, the idea is that when you are in a healthy state, then the people that you keep in your life are on a similar wavelength. So if you are consistently feeling a sense of disappointment or frustration about the people in your environment, whether romantically or platonically, then it might be time to evaluate what's going on with you.
Movie night in Tulum. I was just in Tulum a month ago. Lovely, strange, many little frustrations in getting everything done, but it's coming alive. It's just a growing, building place. I'm curious about the movies, though. I'm curious about what you think, if any, works of fiction, films, books, whatever it might be, portray mature, relational, and emotional human beings.
Ooh, because I have so many current examples of the opposite. Like Baby Reindeer, at the moment that we're recording this, is taking the world by storm. It portrays a Scottish actor. His last name is Gad. It's on Netflix, and it talks about it's a man basically experiencing emotional and other kinds of violence at the hands of a man and a woman, and it's very, very compelling. But in terms of actual healthy relational dynamics, okay. I recently watched a film on, I think it was Amazon Prime, called Nanny. And when I saw the name of the director, I realized the director is someone that I've been connected to on Facebook for like over a decade. And I was like, oh, I have a feeling this is going to be great. And it was fantastic. So we see this woman from Cote d'Ivoire. She immigrates, she's undocumented, immigrates to New York City in search of a better life for her and her young son that she's left back. Oh, sorry, not Cote d'Ivoire. She's from Senegal. Her son in Senegal, and it's very, very beautiful, very mystical. There are portrayals of Mami Wata, who is a Nigerian, who's like a major figure in, I think I want to say, Yoruba spirituality. And she's haunted by Mami Wata. But essentially, by the end of the film, we see this character who experiences a lot of darkness eventually settle down with this very healthy male companion that she encounters as she is moving through her world. And one thing that I found interesting was that possibly in part because she is portraying an African woman, when the gentleman, he's the doorman at the building where she works as a nanny, and possibly because of the fact that she's not an American woman, when he stops her and kind of chats her up and is flirtatious, she doesn't immediately shut him down. She's kind of a little bit more open and curious, and she doesn't immediately agree to start dating him, but slowly he wins her over and they begin dating. And it's just it seems like a very like well-paced romantic connection. And it's really lovely because there isn't anything about the gender war. She's not asking him how much money he makes. He lives in a beautiful Brooklyn brownstone, but it's evident that that house has been in his family for generations. His family is African American, and they've been there for quite some time. And I remember I just really liked that. I was like, these are just two people who who connected and have just like an easy, peaceful dynamic. And then, yeah, I don't want to spoil it in case people choose to watch it, but I'm glad you asked that, because sometimes it can feel rare in mainstream cinema.
Sometimes when a person feels like they're in an emotionally insufficient state, and they feel like their relationships aren't working and their life is going nowhere and they're trapped in a cycle of the same useless repetitions. It can be because they haven't had enough water today, or they didn't do their exercise, or they need to go for a walk. How much of emotional intelligence and emotional maturation is physical?
Ooh, I love that question, because the truth is that, of course, modern or psychotherapy is a modern phenomenon. You know, before that, people had the land, they had the sun, they had the sea. Those were some of their main tools for engaging in nervous system regulation. And then they had other humans, right? Other humans who were generally safe enough to be close with and to share their most private thoughts with. And I absolutely concur that sitting with ourselves in the hot tub is only like, you know, a quarter, a fraction of the developmental work.
We have this contemporary phrase, you just used it, nervous system regulation. It's a very beautiful phrase. It just hearing it reminds you of something you know you should be doing. And I think for most people, most of the time, what they need is a better sense that that's what they should be doing, that they should be taking steps, internal and external, personally and interpersonally, to regulate their nervous system and to be able to approach the problems and situations of their lives from a position of a more regulated nervous system.
Mhm.
But there's also this matter of development and transformation, and for some people in our communities, a special, almost obsessive drive to enter alternative states and see interesting things. And that often requires at least temporary dysregulation of the nervous system, or producing a kind of friction and turbulence and unresolved sense in yourself that pushes you into another zone of behavior. Um, how do we how do we healthily dysregulate our nervous systems?
Yeah, I love that question. I think, particularly when we speak about psychedelic experiences, it's really important that before we partake, that we make sure we have some kind of stability in our lives, financial, um, in terms of our living space, in terms of community that we can rely on, because integration is where the dirty work occurs, right? Because from oftentimes, obviously not always, oftentimes, psychedelic journeys are so beautiful and transcendental and mystical, um, and then we come back to reality, and oftentimes the gap between what we just experienced and the world into which we reemerge can be very painful and can cause tremendous distress. So I think, yes, okay, explore, do the somatic work, do the psychedelic work, but it can be done in a very, very slow and gentle manner. And then also, I'm speaking to myself here as well. We don't have to be perfect. I think I had this idea in the beginning that having a regulated nervous system meant that I was always calm, that I was always sweet, that I was always peaceful. And that's actually not correct, because being regulated means that when something is upsetting, we actually feel the upset. And we might actually like let the person know. Or when something is um, when something is exciting, it's okay to actually feel some of that excitement and to display it, right? Like we don't always have to be even keeled. If we arrive to that middle way, middle place, middle path after doing extensive work, then perfect. But um, what I recognized, um, and of course has been written about extensively by like Chogyam Trungpa and many others, is that sometimes tools like even beautiful tools like Vipassana or K-Pasana can cause further dissociation from what is actually happening inside of our bodies because we use the meditation and the somatic movement to um, to bypass ourselves.
Everyone has cycles and modes of various kinds. But the female menstrual cycle is a very obvious example in human thinking of what cycles are like. And there's a shift in hormonal chemistry, which creates also this alternation in one's emotional state. It's very interesting to me to think about cycles and how much they've been left out of our developmental stage models. We tend to think of the levels as kind of blocks that are stacked on each other, rather than a system that moves back and forth between different modes that it could be in. What do you think? I don't really know what the question is here. In what ways could a more cyclic and mode-like and emotionally shifting understanding of developmental levels enrich our notion of what a developmental worldview is like?
Hmm. I really like this question because I think it actually relates to what I was just saying about my and many others' early attempts at performing nervous system regulation when we were actually in a state of functional freeze. So there were a lot of frozen parts, and we appeared like everything was fine and that we were tranquil, but underneath it was a lot of chaos and distress. And similarly, I think sometimes when we get a hold of these developmental maps and models, we're like, okay, I'm going to be the most advanced human there is. I'm going to be a superhuman and I'm going to be, third tier. And I've, and I understand that. Like, it's a completely, I have compassion for that inclination. But uh, again, that's a form of bypassing because if we're not there yet, we're not there yet. And actually, in my opinion, the mature thing is to accept where we are and to continue on whatever trajectory we're on and just trust that if and when it's aligned for that process of like shifting from one stage to the next to occur during this lifetime, then it will. Without actually attempting to force ourselves out of wherever we're at is part of what causes the the dysregulation and the dysfunction. So then externally things appear one way, but internally there's something else happening, and so that actually causes further disembodiment and separation from ourselves and from the divine.
See if I can try this without looking too obvious. If I can.
Okay.
No, that didn't really work. Okay. Thought I was going to push the shadow away. Um, I used to do these introduction to integral theory courses. And when it came to talk about stages, one of the things I would do was talk about it in terms of different quantities. Like if we're just talking about one, then you're sort of at a stage. But if we're talking about three, we could be talking about your mental, emotional, and physical development. Or if we're talking about six, or if we're talking about 12. So we've got these options like zooming a microscope in and out. When I talked about two variables. I would usually call them the walk and the talk. And a lot of people in these communities and in the world can be very sophisticated cognitively and verbally, even up to speaking an integrated evolutionary multi-perspectival worldview. But then there can be a big gap between that and the embodied communication they make in the world. Now, clearly accepting where you are, is something that can help close that gap. But what else helps a person who's got the mentality start to live it?
Yeah, I love that question. I remember back when several years ago when Clubhouse was a more popular space, there is Diane Musho. Diane Musho once a week would Diane Musho Hamilton, I think is her name. You're probably familiar. She would host um, these rooms once a week, and people would talk about various polarizing topics. And even though at that point I had already studied authentic relating and circling and T group and all these other embodied communication modalities that are either emerge from the integral and other communities like the diamond approach and spiral dynamics or are adjacent. So, and like nonviolent communication, for instance, is adjacent but not from our spaces. Um, but seeing her in action, listening to her in action, listening to her like very gentle, very loving voice and feeling her energy and her presence, I was like, my God, I wish I could take this medicine and just like inject it into every place where there is chaos and people incapable of hearing one another. It became so evident to me as I witnessed people who had fundamentally opposing perspectives come to a place of at least empathizing and being able to articulate one another's ideas, that this got to the heart of so much of what was ailing us as a collective. And so part of the gratitude that I feel for um, Ken Wilber and then the other communities that emerged out of his intellectual labor, is that recognition that I'm very optimistic. I do believe that there is a way forward. I do believe that there is hope, even in the darkest places, even in situations like we have in the Middle East right now. Around that same period, there was a room that went on for weeks, you may remember, with Palestinians and Israelis chatting with one another. And it was facilitated dialogue, but it was very, very diplomatic. And it didn't mean that people didn't have big emotions or grief or anger, but people were able to engage with one another. So I really, really believe that a big part of supporting humans who want to clean up and grow up is teaching them these tools. Because for many of us, a light bulb goes off in our head when we realize, my God, I've been walking around for decades, barely listening to other people, just projecting and making up stories and imagining what they mean, as opposed to getting curious. And wow, people have been doing the same to me.
Trauma that is ongoing in Gaza and many other places in the world
Mhm.
is very difficult to reckon with.
Mhm.
And it's particularly strange in our society because we have information about these things that are very far away. None of our ancestors ever got exposed to horror and trauma hundreds of thousands of miles away, so to speak. For them, it didn't show up. They were dealing with things much closer at hand. And I've noticed in so-called leading edge communities that there's a kind of social pressure to try to sympathize, right? And that can be a very good exercise to help grow and open our heart, especially when we are making ourselves casually immune to the suffering of others in thousands of little ways each day. But there's also a sense in which it's very strange to try to make a point of being a person who sympathizes with this distant horror when it's not affecting your life directly and you don't have any leverage over the situation. And I wonder from the point of view of emotional maturation, like when is it authentic and intelligent to not care, or at least to not make yourself be engaged, to just say, well, that's not for me right now.
Exactly. I think part of it is allowing ourselves to be honest, like honest about our capacity and honest about our desire or lack of desire to engage with that really brutal imagery. I stopped tuning in personally back in, I believe it was November of last year, in part because there were many things happening in my own life on a personal level. And my political perspectives had become more nuanced. So it wasn't so black and white. It wasn't this old story of Palestinians good, Israelis bad, or vice versa, right? And uh, and I just recognized, my God, this is a very, very complex situation. And the best thing that I can do is make sure that I am emotionally and psychologically well. And taking all of this in on a daily basis is not actually aiding in that. In fact, it probably makes it so that I won't be able to help anyone else because I will be suffering so much myself. So I think it's if we are someone who wants to, who, if we are at a stage where we're concerned about the collective, it's discerning, um, how can I best serve the collective? And sometimes the way that we best serve the collective is by tuning out and really, really tending to ourselves so that we can show up in a healthy manner in the spaces that we occupy.
You mentioned circling on authentic relating and the integral scene, and something that comes up in a lot of these spaces is the notion of like an intersubjective field that is a little bit like an entity that exists between and through all the participants. Um, and that's a very interesting thing to think about, and it's a very interesting thing to think about in terms of personal relationships as well. That there can be a kind of a third entity that is created when you get into a relationship, and you don't just have to listen well to your own information and to the other person. You also sort of both have to listen to this entity that is the relationship in an almost religious fashion. Like you have to serve this disembodied entity to some degree. I'm curious what your sense of we as an entity is like in relationships.
Yeah, I think that most of the time people are either overly attuned to what's happening with the other person or overly attuned to what's happening with themselves and not to what is actually occurring in the field. And um, I actually think that's where things can be really juicy because there are so many subtle sensations and emotions and symbols, imagery, so many things emerging that we never name. Usually we're just moving too quickly in the interaction to track them, and how sweet and joyful it can be, even if what emerges is something that feels sad or heavy, right? Just unlocking that new level of truth. can be so liberating.
Well, maybe that's a good place to bring to an end this chapter of our dialogue. It would be fun to do this in person, on stage, or something like that. That would be great. But I look forward to our next discussion. It's been very lovely having you with us.
Absolutely. It's been lovely being here. And before we go, I noticed some curiosity about where you went just now, like before we pause.
Mm. I went into a kind of, you were discussing slowing down, and you were slowing down as you spoke. So I went into gaps opening up in
Mhm.
that space
Mhm.
and into a buzzing and a kind of an anchoring. And I felt like it was like dropping an anchor to the bottom of the ocean to see if the bottom of the ocean was there. And it was, and it bounced back up. So I wanted to check and make sure it went all the way down so that I wasn't hmm, sort of arbitrarily bringing the discussion to an end, but really being present with its desire to be finished at the moment or something like
Yeah,
that.
beautiful. Thank you so much. And it was a delight. And um, yeah, I believe you're going to be at ICON presenting. So good luck with your presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, we're hoping to do something interesting, a little bit more than a talk, a kind of a vibe.
Beautiful. And
It's been
congratulations on your recent publication um, through Sky Meadow Press. The Gurdjieff book, the title escapes me right now. Please feel free to repeat it.
Gurdjieff for a Time Between Worlds, and thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
All
All
right.
right. Peace out.
Talk to you again soon.